Guitar Center is the largest retailer of musical instruments in the United States. Nobody sells more of them, so I'm sure that most serious musicians have at least spent some time there. They are approaching 300 locations across the country. They're in almost every state, and they are the owners of another popular chain of music stores called Music and Arts, in addition to a few others like the online retailer Musician's Friend. It's a big company that unfortunately has not been doing that well. In fact, in November of 2020, they filed for bankruptcy. Now, I should point out that they still do exist. They came out of it within a month, and they've never had to downsize or do anything like that, but it's still a bad sign. In this video, I'm going to argue that Guitar Center's struggles have been more than 2 decades in the making. Your first reaction might be to think that the pandemic is behind the bankruptcy, and that is true to a degree, but I'm going to show you that it was actually just the final blow in a 4-punch combo that goes back to the 1990s. But before I get to that, I want to talk about what made Guitar Center so big and awesome in the first place. So my first reason behind their early success would be the British invasion and Vox. Now, I'm not talking about the media company. This is a British brand of music equipment, mostly known for their amplifiers, that got really popular in the 1960s. See, during that time, there were all of these great rock bands coming out of Britain and becoming popular in the United States. The ultimate example of this would be the Beatles. They were huge. Well, the Beatles had a deal with Vox, as did some of the other bands, where they were using Vox-branded stuff for, I believe, all of their live performances. And of course, everyone wanted to be like the Beatles, so all of a sudden, there was a huge public demand for that brand. That is where Wayne Mitchell became involved. He was already the owner and operator of an organ store called Organ Center in Hollywood, California, when he was pressured by one of his organ suppliers to start selling some Vox equipment. It was in 1964, by the way, right when a lot of this stuff was just starting to catch on, so he saw big potential for this brand and guitars in general. It motivated him to open an entirely separate, I guess, spin-off store called Vox Center. Clearly, that was a good decision because it quickly started doing much better than his original store, so over the next few years, he continued shifting more of his attention toward Vox Center, eventually renaming it Guitar Center, and that was the start of it. Catching on to these trends and investing in them early on is what established Guitar Center in the first place. Another contributor to their early success would be low prices, because Wayne Mitchell felt that it was important to price the equipment as low as possible. It was done partially by making up for the difference through the sale of higher margin accessories like straps and picks, but mostly through excessive cost cutting. That first Guitar Center was nothing fancy. It famously had old carpets fixed up with duct tape, and he bought the display cases from bankruptcy sales. He did not want to spend much money on the appearance of the store, which fortunately did create an underground alternative type atmosphere that proved to be attractive to many of the rock and roll customers. Also attractive about Guitar Center was their sales staff. Wayne Mitchell was actually a former used car salesman, so he understood the importance of that aspect. Most of the people that he hired were musicians, so they had a good knowledge base about the products that they were selling. He was also known to promote them into management positions. It got to a point where most of their top executives had started as salesmen. In 1980, he even started the stock ownership program for the people who worked there, all things that helped lead to happier, more effective, long-term employees, and theoretically, a friendly and helpful environment for the customers. The next thing on my list would probably be the thing that Guitar Center is most known for, and that's testing the products. You can go in there and just start playing the instruments. It's helpful in deciding what you want to buy, or just makes it a cool place to hang out and visit for a little bit. And this is applicable especially in modern times. They've even remodeled many of their stores to open up space and further emphasize it because it remains a huge advantage that they have over internet retailers. I feel like that one is pretty self-explanatory. So for my final reason, I want to mention the gimmicks. Wayne Mitchell loved doing crazy things to get attention. He once set a Guinness World Record by keeping one of his stores open for 11 days straight, and then another record by making this huge guitar cake. And then maybe not a gimmick, but along the same lines would be their famous Rock Walk. It's a kind of music version of the Hollywood Walk of Fame where famous musicians put their handprints in the sidewalk. It helps make their Sunset Boulevard store into a big tourist attraction. Obviously, there could be so many things on this list, but for the first few decades of Guitar Center, I would say that these are some of the biggest reasons as to why they were doing so well. In 1983, when there were only 9 Guitar Center stores, mostly still in California, Wayne Wayne Mitchell had a heart attack and died at age 57. At the time, a man named Ray Scher was the president of Guitar Center. He had actually started there years earlier as a salesman, and through some transactions, he became the new majority shareholder. Under his control over the next 13 years, Guitar Center methodically added about 20 more stores. Then, in 1996, the management from Guitar Center got together with some venture capital companies, took out a $100 million loan, and used that money to buy Ray Scher's share of the company. The following year, Guitar Center had an initial public stock offering that raised $90 million, part of which was used to reduce that debt. Since they were now a public company for the first time ever, they were pressured by the investors to raise that stock price by expanding the business, and that was the start of their trouble. It's hard to even express how fast they were growing. They went from 28 stores to around 200 in a little more than a decade. From about $200 million in sales to $2 billion in that same time period, and this is also when they started acquiring those other retailers. They bought Musician's Friend for $50 million in 1999, and then they bought Music and Arts for almost $100 million in 2005. And I realize that most of what I'm saying here and looking at these numbers, it does all seem impressive, but we also have to consider the downsides of it. For one, this underground alternative store was now becoming the exact opposite of that, being viewed as and operating as more of a corporate entity. You know all the issues that can bring, appearing that they care more about profits and their employees or their customers, which creates a much different atmosphere in the stores. Hiring practices have been questioned, there have been unionizing efforts at some of the locations. It's a lot to get into here, but I would say that it has hurt their reputation. Also, this company that has always been very slow and careful when researching new areas to open stores was no longer being as slow and careful, potentially leading to new stores in less than ideal areas. Maybe they're too pricey, maybe there's not as many musicians in the area, maybe there's high competition, maybe they're too close to an existing Guitar Center. Even though these expansion efforts had mostly positive results in the beginning, by around 2006, 2007, they were starting to see some negative effects. Their sales per store was down, their net income had fallen considerably, and their stock price had been slowly declining as a result of it. Leading me to the second part of the decline, words that no one likes to hear on this channel, a leveraged buyout. In 2007, private investment firm Bain Capital wanted to take advantage of that lower stock price and decided to buy Guitar Center in a $2.1 billion deal, most of which was funded by debt. So if we look at the graph of debt for Guitar Center, I think we can see how this complicated things. Also, on top of that, 2007 was an unfortunate year to add $1 billion in debt, because 2008 and the years that followed were tough economically. That was the third punch. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that when people are tight on money, they're not likely to buy new musical instruments. In fact, the market for guitar sales specifically was believed to be at an all-time low around that time, and clearly you would expect that to have an impact over at Guitar Center. In the following years, they stopped opening new stores, their sales fell, and for the first time, at least as a public company, they started losing money. I want to remind you that these losses would not be nearly as severe if they didn't have that leveraged buyout. When you are $1 billion in debt, you have to pay some pretty sizable interest payments. In this case, over $100 million a year, so I think we're starting to see how dangerous everything was looking. In 2014, the main company that Guitar Center owed money to, Aries Management, basically agreed to exchange over $500 million of debt into equity. It was a deal that lowered their debt and therefore their interest payments by about $70 million a year, giving them some space to operate, but it also made Aries Management the controlling owner. So that was helpful in allowing things to continue, but things were still bad. The financial reports haven't been available to the public since that point, but they were clearly still having trouble. Moody's, the credit rating agency, downgraded their rating multiple times, concluding that Guitar Center was looking less and less likely to be able to pay off the money that they still owed. And that takes us to the final blow, the pandemic. They were forced to shut down the majority of their stores for a while, forcing many of the musical instrument sales to occur over the internet with online competitors like Sweetwater, who did very well during that time. I think we can all tell by this point, after everything that had happened over the past 20 plus years, that Guitar Center was not in a stable enough position to handle a setback like this. Without those sales, they were unable to make their debt payments, and when you're unable to make your debt payments, you have to file for bankruptcy. But there is reason to believe that there could still be a bright future for Guitar Center. The obvious thing is the fact that they came out of the bankruptcy so fast with their debt reduced by $800 million, finally giving them some much needed stability and freedom to spend their money in more productive ways. And the demand for guitars does seem to be moving in a positive direction. In one of those court documents, they claim that before the bankruptcy, their comparable store sales had been growing for 10 consecutive quarters, suggesting that they may have already started some sort of a comeback before it was interrupted. It's impossible to give any real predictions here, but as of right now, there are some good signs. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of Guitar Center? Were you one of the select few that were actually there at the original store, or one of the first 30 locations before things exploded? If so, I'm curious as to what was most different about them when compared to today. Was it mostly covered in this video, or is there more to be said about it? And for the much larger group of people that has only been to the modern day Guitar Center, what has been your experience? I know there's plenty to criticize, but they do have a variety that you can test, and they're probably not too far away, so are you better off going there or somewhere else or online? And any other thoughts you have about this crazy story, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.